Welcome everybody, and a very good evening. Welcome to this year's Lakatos Award lecture. My name is Roman Frick, and I will be your chair for this lecture. The aim of the Lakatos Award is to honor the late Imre Lakatos. As you know, he was an important philosopher of science and mathematics. He was also a professor here at the LSE until his untimely death at the relatively tender age of 51 years in 1974. He had a lasting impact on the debate, and in order to keep this impact going, this award has been donated, and we keep giving it every year. Now, the award is given for a book in the philosophy of science and mathematics that has been published in the last 5 years. The award has been given for many years now, and among the winners we find some of the most important figures in the field. It's therefore an immense pleasure to welcome Mazviita Chirimuuta, who wins this year's Lakatos Award for her book, The Brain, Abstracted Simplification in the History and Philosophy of Neuroscience. Congratulations. Mazviita Chirimuuta currently is a senior lecturer in philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. Her research interests lie in the philosophy of perception and the history of the mind-brain sciences and the philosophy of neuroscience. She received her PhD in vision science from Cambridge in 2004. Following that, she held postdocs in perceptual psychology and in philosophy at Monash University and at Washington University in St. Louis. Between 2011 and 2020, she was first an assistant and then an associate professor in history and philosophy of science at the University of Pittsburgh. And in 2020, she joined her current university.
Thank you all for coming. Needless to say, it's a tremendous honor to receive this award. I was over the moon about it. Thank you for coming. And I wanted to prepare a lecture today, which is kind of about the genesis of the book, the things that I was thinking about that kind of provoked me into writing the book that I ended up writing. So it's not a book about AI, but there were changes in neuroscience sort of happening because of how the technology was evolving, which really made me rethink the role of simplification in the science. And this is the story that I'm going to tell tonight. Also, I've added some bits to the stories based on changes that I've seen in neuroscience actually happening since the publication of the book. So there's going to be a kind of, does need something to, there's going to be the before and the after.
Sorry, I don't know why this is...
Okay, all right, there we go. Right, so I'll begin. This isn't going to be a lecture about technology bringing about the end of the world. Apocalyptic is meant in the original sense of bringing about a revelation, making apparent something that lay concealed. The revelation in question concerns the limits of science. I take inspiration from Émile Dubois-Reymond, a German neurophysiologist, one of the first to measure electrical activity in the nerves. He began a public lecture in 1872 with the following words. Just as a world conqueror of ancient times, as he halts for a day in the midst of his victorious career, might long to see the boundaries of the vast territories he has subjugated more clearly defined, so that here he may levy tribute of some nation hitherto exempt, or that there he may discern some natural barrier that cannot be overcome by his horsemen, and which constitutes the true limit of his power. In like manner, it will not be out of place if natural science, the world conqueror of our times, resting as on a festive occasion from her labour, should strive to define the true boundaries of her immense domain. The lecture, in fact, became notorious. Controversy ensued from the very suggestion that natural science might have a limit, that there might be some features of the world which scientists will leave forever unexplained. Incidentally, the limit that Dubois-Reymond proposed was consciousness, the explanation of how material processes in the brain give rise to our various conscious experiences. To this day, the problem remains unresolved. I will follow de Bois-Reymond in defining the limits of science as the limits of scientists' collective ability to understand the natural world. Like him, I am concerned with the question of whether there are phenomena that we can expect to remain incomprehensible, no matter how far science advances. My central claim in this lecture is that AI, machine learning used as a modeling tool within neuroscience, has revealed that these limits are tighter than de Bois-Reymond had envisaged. Not only consciousness, but seemingly more tractable problems to do with unconscious information processing in the visual system turn out to have a surprising degree of conceptual and mathematical opacity due to the brain's remarkable complexity. Scientists normally have a firm belief in the intelligibility of the universe, a faith that everything is figure-outable. This manifests as a conviction that despite the apparent complexity of natural phenomena, especially biological ones, there is a hidden simplicity which means that some elegant theoretical principles or neat mathematical equations will account for them all, making the once mysterious now comprehensible. I'll begin my argument with a bit of autobiography, an account of how this belief played a role in my early training in neuroscience, and how technological developments led me to doubt it. But why think that our human capacity for understanding marks the limits of science? The subsequent part of the lecture will present the reasons for this view, followed by an assessment of the current situation in neuroscience, how some researchers are embracing technology without pursuing the traditional scientific aim of offering explanations, while others are seeking new ways to confront the full complexity of the brain, while retaining the goal of understanding it. I will finish with some reflections on the role of philosophy in this challenging but exciting new territory. Though currently my academic home is in a department of philosophy, I started out my career as a scientist in a lab. The research that led to my PhD was a combination of experiments to measure visual thresholds in human subjects, including myself, and programming computer models to simulate the responses of neurons in the early visual system, primary visual cortex, which is the orange blob on this slide, to see if our models could predict the thresholds that we actually observed experimentally. My supervisor, David Tolhurst, had done seminal work in the 1970s recording directly from visual neurons, seeking to establish the hypothesis that the basic operation of cells in this area is to act as a linear filter of messages originally landing on the retina and passed up via the optic nerve to the brain. If the cells are linear, it means that you can predict how they will respond to any complicated image or pattern of light sent to the eye, such as the images that you get when you look around this room, just on the basis of how they respond to very simple artificial stimuli like these bars up here. And we use stimuli like these in the lab. If the linearity hypothesis were correct, it would also mean that the behavior of these neurons could be summarized by what is mathematically a very simple equation with just a few variables. Already in the 1990s, it was clear that there were discrepancies between the data and the linearity hypothesis. In particular, it was found that the activity of any one neuron was influenced by the responses of other neurons to an unexpected degree. However, my supervisor and other researchers were aiming to make a few tweaks and additions to the original linear model that would account for these discrepancies and ultimately allow us to predict how the neurons would respond to the realistic images, not just the artificial ones. I was in the lab in the early 2000s, and we had some degree of success with these adjustments. We published 3 articles specifically on the problem of extending the models to realistic images. But I could tell that David was never satisfied with the results, and he carried on tweaking the models in different ways, which he showed me when I came back to visit the lab after I'd left to do research elsewhere and had eventually started my new life as a philosopher of science. During my time as a student, I remember thinking how curious it was that we were attempting to encapsulate the workings of these neurons in mathematical models which were, to be honest, trivially simple. I hadn't learned any computer programming before starting in the lab, and my education in maths had finished after 1 year in university, which means that any advanced modeling would have been beyond me. And the thing was that even though I was not doing experiments on the brain myself, I had to read a lot of papers reporting on the responses of these neurons in various kinds of experiments. And it struck me that there was a great deal of intricacy here that was hard to pin down. And my supervisor had been studying the visual cortex his whole career and knew far more about these neurons than anyone else in the lab. And that very fact impressed me, how one scientist could devote so much time to one class of cell and still not be satisfied that he's figured them out. If one cell is such a challenge, what hope have we for the whole brain? Yet, if the linearity hypothesis were true, there was hope, because in the face of all this apparent complexity, there would be one straightforward mathematical principle at play. It shows you how, in our lab, belief in the intelligibility of nature, to be specific, belief in the underlying simplicity of the brain, was so important. Otherwise, we couldn't say why there should be any expectation that some version of a linear model would be the key that would unlock everything we wanted to know about how these cells contribute to our rich and varied experiences. I didn't think too much again about the challenge of building these predictive models until 2018, when I had a sabbatical to begin work on the project that would become the brain abstracted. I had the idea to revisit primary visual cortex and see how the current results stood. Attending conferences, I'd noticed that many labs had introduced a kind of modeling based on deep convolutional networks, similar to AI models used for face recognition, as a means to predict the tough cases where cells are responding to realistic stimuli. The accuracy of predictions was remarkably better than had been achieved with versions of the linear model. At the same time, these models were based on a linear hypothesis, not based on a linear hypothesis or any hypothesis about the kind of function that these cells were performing, and so the theoretical payoff was unclear. I should also add as a footnote to this, nothing that I'm saying about using these models as predictive models, as neuronal responses, depends on them being in any way brain-like. You can use these deep convolutional networks as predictive models for all kinds of systems. So it's not a special case of them being particularly good at predicting brain responses. They're very good at predicting lots and lots of things. At the same time, they operated more like a black box, an oracle that spat out the right answer without explaining to you what was going on. If your motivation as a scientist is to figure these cells out, this is unhelpful. I emailed David about this, and he shared the sentiment. Yes, the new network methods work, but it means giving up on science, he said. There was clearly a conundrum. Either you build a simple model that makes mathematical sense and gives you understanding of how the neurons respond in the way that they do, but only in a very narrow range of cases, or you can build an immensely more complex, mathematically opaque model that works accurately across the board but doesn't yield understanding of the responses. The goal of science, as I'd grown up with it, was to have both, understanding and the ability to make predictions. If you give up on one of these, understanding, then what you're doing isn't really science, it's engineering. That was mine and David's reaction. Fortunately, I didn't have to choose between science and engineering because by then, as a philosopher, I had the luxury of sitting back to reflect on the significance of these developments, asking what these new modeling technologies have revealed. For one thing, they seem to suggest that not everything is figure-outable. There may be some things in nature, like a single cell of a living brain, whose workings are so involved that to predict their responses, scientists need to use AI to build models of such mathematical complexity that the models no longer make sense to their users. This would mean that science, with its central goal of understanding the natural world, has a limit. That because of the bounds of how much complexity any one person or group of people can make sense of, no matter how intellectually gifted, some questions about the natural world may not have intelligible answers. For another, it suggested that up until now, the working hypothesis of neuroscientists had been that the brain is vastly more simple than it actually is. In retrospect, our linearity hypothesis looked like a piece of wishful thinking. This observation led me to make simplification the central topic of my book. Why had scientists assumed that something as apparently complicated as the brain was fundamentally quite simple? How do experimental methods and controls make neural systems behave as if they were always as simple as we had hoped? How do representational abstractions, such as mathematical models, strip away biological complexity? What are the dangers of oversimplification? It turned out to be quite a long book, and I can't dwell on these other questions now. Instead, I will say more about this uncertain goal of understanding. What the results of the new AI methods in neuroscience suggested to me was that science has a limit. But this conclusion depended on a conception of science in which the goal of understanding the natural world is central and essential. One might object, why should I be defining the limits of science as the limits of scientists' collective ability to understand the natural world? I need to say more about this conception of science. I follow a number of historians and philosophers of science in a characterization of the new experimental and theoretical practices that emerged in the 17th century as a hybrid of two previously disconnected activities. The first was natural philosophy, the contemplation of the order of nature. It occurred in the context of classical antiquity and medieval Christianity practiced by an educated elite. Understanding of nature was sought for its own sake as a pure intellectual inquiry, not to be put to any use. The second was mechanical craft, the diverse kinds of practical skills employed by uneducated artisans who needed to produce stuff in order to make a living. As John Dewey observed, to quote, the distinction was reinforced by social causes. Mechanics were concerned with mechanical arts. They were lower in the social scale. The alliance of natural philosophy and mechanical craft came about with the emergence of a new middle class, as argued by Edmund Husserl, and the development of a machinic view of the universe, as argued by Peter Deer. So on this slide, I'm illustrating what Peter Deer calls this double-faced conception of natural science, in which there are these twin goals of understanding and instrumentality that are fundamentally connected together, but depending on this aspect switch of the Necker cube, one face stands in front, one face is more salient. The natural world came to be understood in the work of 17th century natural philosophers such as René Descartes and Robert Boyle as a system closely analogous to a mechanical device in which discrete components interact according to precise physical laws. Such machines are intelligible to their makers, and if the natural world is like that, it too can be understood through a process of reverse engineering, thereby enabling the philosopher's task of understanding the natural order. At the same time, mechanical devices are eminently manipulable because they have a transparent and stable causal structure. By treating things as machines, scientists can seek to discern causal structures that can be used to manipulate natural processes and bend them to suit human agendas. So on the slides here, we have a picture of Francis Bacon's wonderfully quirky book, New Atlantis, where this new vision of manipulating nature through scientific knowledge is fictionalized. Thus, the goals of understanding and engineering, previously separate, could be combined. The slogan of Francis Bacon, that knowledge is power, that the attainment of knowledge inherently confers some ability to exert control, seems obvious, unquestionable to us now. However, at the start of the 17th century, the utility of knowledge needed to be argued for as an alternative to the fruitless intellectual excursions of the scholastics. We'll now say a little more about the properties of machines so that we can contrast the old picture with the alternative picture of biological complexity that has come to prominence recently. In a machine, the parts do not depend on the whole. The parts pre-exist the whole device and are put together by the person assembling the machine. The parts are supposed to be stable, not changing with the running of the machine. By envisaging nature as machine-like, it was supposed that natural systems decompose into stable subsystems. This justifies reductionist investigations focused on low-level components, such as cells and molecules, separated from the entire body. In a machine world, things are bounded, modular. it's not the case that everything potentially affects everything else, as was often supposed in the former natural philosophy, which, incidentally, was a reason for believing in the efficacy of astrology and magic. In a modular world, the division of labor in biology is well motivated. It makes sense to study the immune system separately from cardiology, the brain separately from the kidneys. If you tried to study all these systems in detail at once, things would soon get out of hand. In the machine world, there is an underlying simplicity due to the components being stable and fairly insensitive to context. This lends an intelligibility to the natural world because things turn out to be decomposable into relatively independent modules that can be investigated piecemeal with reductionist strategies. In case you're wondering what I mean by understanding, since I haven't defined it yet, some relevant points arise here. Understanding has recently become a flourishing topic within the philosophy of science. According to some, understanding consists in knowing an explanation where explaining is accounted for in various ways, such as the discovery of biological mechanisms. Another view is that understanding amounts to the possession of certain skills or abilities to perform certain tasks to do with prediction and control of a system. There is a common theme here. All these accounts of understanding relate in some way to the machinic view of nature, the idea that understanding a natural system consists in certain instrumental skills stems ultimately from the concept of maker's knowledge. The builder of a machine knows how it works and can do things with it because he or she has put the parts together and is aware of the operating principles. Scientific understanding aspires to that through the practice of reverse engineering, treating a natural system as if it were an artifact and trying to discover its operating principles. Likewise, the notion that explanation involves knowing the mechanism of a natural system, or more generally its causal structure, is intuitive only because we think of the system as having a stable network of specific causal relations, as found in a mechanical device. In addition, there is the shared view of understanding as what leads directly to prediction and control. For instance, pure scientists discover causal relations in a brain area, and applied scientists leverage them to create novel interventions, such as cures for a disease. Nowadays, various biologists and philosophers of biology are arguing that the machine conception of nature is obsolete and needs to be replaced with a process view of the living world. A key claim of process biology is that there are no underlying stable parts and causal relations because everything is context dependent and context itself is always changing. What this implies is that ultimately reductionism will fail, that nature is not intelligible through this bottom-up method of investigation. It also implies that there are no absolute boundaries around things. The organs within a living body and the organisms within an ecology are not as modular as the machine picture would have us think. There is mutual dependency and relationality across multiple scales. Causal relations are neither fixed nor discrete. This is a kind of complexity not anticipated on the old machinic worldview. I suggested it was revealed by the inadequacy of traditional models using simplifying assumptions like the linearity hypothesis that ultimately come from reductionism and the machine picture. When put in confrontation with AI models which dispense with those simplifying assumptions, their limitations became clear. What this also reveals is something historians such as Peter Deer already pointed out. There is a historical contingency in the alliance between natural philosophy and mechanical craft, or more generally, between the activities of seeking to understand the natural world and seeking to manipulate nature through technology. These endeavors came together at a certain point in history after previously existing as separate spheres of activity, and they could come apart again. With AI, we see the predictive power needed for instrumental success in applied science losing its moorings from the understanding sought by pure science. It's reasonable to wonder if the flagship successes of science seen in the last few centuries have been due to something of a coincidence, the discovery of a delimited range of things for which the predictively powerful theories and models are also intelligible to human scientists. Given these successes, it was assumed that the natural world just is that way, simultaneously intelligible to scientific reason and amenable to technological control. But it could well be that there is nothing in the fabric of the world ensuring that understanding and technological success should accompany one another. Instead, that we should only expect this for the few things in nature that are quite simple, or rather simplifiable without a disturbing loss of predictive accuracy. Those quarries of things that are both understandable and controllable have been mined intensively for some time. The divergence of models for prediction and understanding in the 21st century is perhaps the first indication that a resource, once taken to be unlimited, is depletable after all. And if this raw material for science, things subjectable simultaneously to scientific understanding and manipulation, is limited and non-renewable, it means that science itself has a limit. At least we see that the old settlement is no longer tenable. In the next part of the lecture, we'll consider some developments that are occurring in neuroscience, given the breakdown of the old settlement. So here we are. What happens when scientists give up on the assumption of underlying simplicity within nature? The assumption which justifies use of widespread simplification, such as linear models and reductionist methods. Specifically, what happens when neuroscientists give up on the idea that the brain is not more simple than it seems, that it is not amenable to elegance, unifying, and explanatory theories of the sort prized in physics. I will now describe three responses to the new situation. First, that neuroscience becomes neuroengineering. Second, that neuroscience continues to pursue its twin goals of understanding and intervention, but without the assumption of underlying simplicity. Third, that neurophilosophy emerges as an endeavor divorced from the goal of intervention. Okay. So this is the revolutionary option. Okay. Under the old settlement, science was formed of an alliance between natural philosophy and technology, meaning that it inherited the twin goals of understanding the natural world and seeking to control it. Given the breakdown of the old settlement, one option is to drop the goal of understanding and let science develop into a pure technological endeavor, aided by AI and other tools for prediction and control. Back in 2008, half a decade before the start of the current wave of AI through deep learning, Chris Anderson, editor of Wired magazine, prophesied that data mining methods perfected by Google would show their effectiveness in the sciences, where accumulation of data had outpaced theoretical innovation. Models, Anderson wrote, are systems visualized in the minds of scientists. The models are then tested and experiments confirm or falsify theoretical models of how the world works. He continued, the more we learn about biology, the further we find ourselves from a model that can explain it. However, there is now a better way. We can stop looking for explanatory models. We can analyze the data without hypotheses about what it might show. We can throw the numbers into the biggest computing clusters the world has ever seen and let statistical algorithms find patterns where science cannot. Anderson has certainly been criticized for overstating the case for hypothesis-free models and theories. Science is data mining without specific scientific expertise. For one thing, successful use of these methods depends on high-quality data, and without scientific expertise, data quality can't be evaluated. The central law of computing is as relevant as ever: garbage in, garbage out. That said, Anderson hit upon a trend that would occur in some form. Not that computer engineers would replace scientists, but that scientists would take up the methods of engineers. An example of this tendency comes from Jim DiCarlo's lab at MIT. This group was amongst those leading the introduction of deep learning in visual neuroscience, as I discussed earlier. In one study from 2019, they built an artificial neural network, or ANN, model of neuronal responses in area V4 of the visual cortex, and used this model to devise stimuli that would maximally excite those neurons, driving them to produce more action potentials than when exposed to any other stimulus. And that's what's shown on the left on this slide. One of the purposes of the study was actually to address criticisms that their previous ANN models of the visual cortex were impressive gadgets that did not yield understanding of the brain. In this study, by showing that their model can be used to, quote, to control the brain, they believed they had a, quoting again, practical test of useful causal understanding. This is a very interesting remark because in effect it lays down a redefinition of scientific understanding. From a sense of comprehension or ability to grasp the principles of a thing, they switch to a purely pragmatic criterion. A system is understood if and when it can be controlled. Previously, we saw that scientific understanding has been tied to instrumentality as maker's knowledge, the understanding available to the designer of a system in virtue of it operating according to her design. The thing about artificial neural networks is that they are self-organizing systems that learn the solution by following a training algorithm. Therefore, the maker of the ANN does not know the principles of the solution embedded in the trained network. As with actual neural systems, the workings of trained artificial neural networks are quite opaque. Two neuroscientists commenting on the DiCarlo project make some interesting observations comparing the new notion of understanding with the former one in which understanding required the reduction of a system into parts that are simpler and hence more intelligible. So here's Batista and Cording. The ANN approach, as applied by Bashivan et al., advances a different conception of understanding. We understand a system when we can control it. Most of us understand our cars in this latter sense, predictability and controllability, without really understanding them in the former reductive sense. The authors, by showing that they can steer neural populations to pre-selected states, have demonstrated that they indeed understand the visual system in the sense of controllability. We wonder, is the reductive notion of understanding even possible for a system as complex as the brain? Or might the I can control it notion of understanding actually be a more effective and relevant way forward for neuroscience? Still, one point of continuity between the old settlement and this tech-driven trend is that they both employ the machinic conception of a natural system. Neuroscientists such as DiCarlo embrace the idea that the brain literally is a computing machine executing algorithms like the ones running in his ANN servers. The difference is that with the new kinds of machines, even the makers don't know how they really work. More recently, neuroscientists have taken up the idea of foundation models from the tech sector. This is the kind of modeling strategy behind large language models such as ChatGPT, one that requires exhaustive amounts of data. A group from Andreas Tolias's lab showed that by training a foundation model on data of about 100,000 neurons recorded from the visual cortex of 14 different mice, this approach achieved an unprecedented level of accuracy when challenged to predict the responses of neurons in another group of mice to novel video stimuli. Within psychology, actual large language models, tweaked to predict the results of behavioral tasks given to human participants in the lab, have been shown to outperform most traditional models in the field in terms of predictive accuracy. Amongst scientists, this development has, of course, raised the question of what can be learned and understood about human cognition by having an ANN that can reproduce human-like results without revealing the processing steps which led to the outputs. Stanford psychologist Russell Poldrack has offered an answer here. His view is that the predictive power of a model is not in tension with its ability to provide understanding, that there is not a trade-off between prediction and understanding, as I, for one, have argued, because the concepts of prediction and understanding are linked. Both involve data compression. So this is what is here on these slides that I borrowed from him. So you can think of, where's my pointer coming up? You can think of the challenge of cognition as being confronted with all these messy data points, and the challenge is to sort of build a compact model, or a compressed model of all of this messy data in order to kind of save memory capacity. There's a true underlying trend, which is represented by the dashed line. So how he thinks what's going on with human cognition is that we have lots of messy data. There's an underlying trend which is more complex than our tendency to fit things in simple models tends to do. So you can have a 2-parameter linear model and you can get the rough trend of the scatter plot, but you're missing a lot of the underlying pattern. So he thinks that the scientific models that we like, because they make sense to us, they're just showing relationships between a couple of variables, are very, very lossy compressions. They're underfitting the data. And what happens when you build an artificial neural network and you have tons of parameters, you can, without overfitting, capture an underlying trend. So you still have a compression, but one that is not horribly lossy. So the issue for him is just that the data compressions that make intuitive sense to us humans are low-dimensional and too lossy, like this one on the left, especially if the data set has multiple complex interactions. Whereas AI achieves compressions that are high-dimensional and not too lossy, which is why they are able to achieve predictive power where traditional models, the low-dimensional ones that are intuitive to us, have failed. So one thing I should have said here in Poljak's view is that both, as he puts it, both understanding and prediction are relying on this same underlying process of compression. So he doesn't think that understanding and prediction are different things. Both involve data compression, but we should embrace the AI data compressions. And also, Poljak argues that AIs such as large language models are not as opaque as we feared. With some probing, some of their workings can be interpreted. So this is an example that he talks about. This is a slide from Anthropic's website, where they report on their technique of mechanistic interpretability. So what they're actually doing is something a bit similar to neuroscience, as they're looking at small patterns of activation in an LLM and looking at what patterns of text production they are primarily associated with, just as a neuroscientist will look at sort of patterns of activity in the brain and try and associate them with what it is that the person is doing behaviorally or cognitively. On this last point, I think we have a situation of glass half full, half empty. Indisputably, AIs are more opaque than the models traditionally built by scientists. The fact that they are not completely opaque black boxes, that they can be reverse engineered to some extent, gives the optimist like Poljak cause to say, well, at least they offer something by way of helping us to understand the systems we're predicting. That they are far less intelligible than the previous standard of explanatory models gives the pessimist like me reason to say that a trade-off does obtain. The greater predictive power of these models is bought at the cost of having a model that makes much less sense to its users. There will always be an opacity to these technologies, an ability to generate answers without anyone fully knowing how, since otherwise they would not be a useful alternative to unaided human cognition. If really transparent, they would only ever produce the answers that a user could, in principle, know in advance, from knowing how the device works. As applied physicist Kevin Kelly pointed out, and I quote, "The power of a technology is proportional to its inherent out-of-controlness, its inherent ability to surprise and be generative. In fact, unless we can worry about a technology, it's not revolutionary enough." My conclusion, therefore, is that the faster neuroscience advances with AI, the further the traditional goal of scientific understanding will be left behind. This accelerationist trend gives cause for concern, for it allows intervention to be pursued without theoretical understanding. We've learned through bitter experience that unintended consequences always follow interventions, even when due theoretical diligence has been done. How much more so when neuro and also bioengineering operates unchecked by the aim of figuring out what is actually going on. That could, we can worry, be apocalyptic in the usual sense of the word. But fortunately, this is not the only thing that's going on. Within neuroscience and other branches of biology, we also see an alternative direction developing in response to the breakdown of the old settlements. I call this one the new settlement because it retains the twin goals of understanding and instrumentality, and the notion that pure science will lead to applied science, but it drops reductionism and the machine picture. At least that's the intent. With this, it also gives up the presumption of an underlying simplicity to the living world in favour of a much more dynamic and complex view of things. The challenge is to pursue the goal of understanding nonetheless. Philip Ball has written about this new path in the popular science book, How Life Works, beginning with the admission that previous molecular and genetic approaches in biology have been guilty of oversimplification. And I quote, "Just about all the neat stories that researchers routinely tell about how living cells work are incomplete, flawed, or just totally mistaken. All the same, I believe we can do better. I will show how research in molecular and cell biology over the past several years has painted a richer and more astonishing picture than the bleak and obsolete mechanical metaphor. The picture does at times appear fantastically baroque and perplexing, and it relies instead of the old view on principles and processes of self-organization." Similarly, the neuroscientist Nicole Rust has published a book this year placing blame for the lack of advances in translational neuroscience, its failure to discover cures for neurodegenerative conditions such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, at the door of reductionism and its simplistic linear model of causation. So what's depicted on the right here is the former linear model of disease pathology and Alzheimer's disease, where you begin with a single trigger event, which is mutation in a cell, so genetic defect, which leads to problem with a particular kind of protein, amyloid beta, and these tangle and form nasty plaques, and this causes a problem with another protein, tau, and that causes nasty tangles, and then you have cell death at the end of this line of cause and effect. The old picture is to be replaced with a view of the brain as a complex, adaptive, dynamical system. As with Ball's reference to self-organization, a new suite of concepts is borrowed from complexity science. Instead of linear causation like a domino chain, we have a dense causal web where, due to the ubiquity of feedback, it becomes unfeasible to disentangle causes from effects. Processes contributing to pathology occur at multiple scales beyond the molecular level and interact with one another across scales, as depicted here, and that's an image from the book. With this in place, we can appreciate why expectations for neural therapies have not been met, and better see the inherent difficulty of the problem. Traditional bench-to-bedside methods approach the disease like Alzheimer's at one level, the lowest level here depicted, of genes and proteins. Enormous sums of money were spent on developing a treatment which very effectively removes the suspect protein, amyloid beta, but this turned out to have negligible clinical impacts on cognitive decline. On the new approach outlined by Rust, we must conceive of Alzheimer's as a multi-level pathology with causal loops going through the environment, potentially impacting processes at all other levels. But we cannot bring the environment into the lab. Previously, Alzheimer's researchers studied model systems in labs, abstracting away from complexity due to environmental interactions, generating tractable problems. But their advances were lost in translation because the actual disease occurs in a human brain housed in a body belonging to a person who belongs to a family and lives in a society. The continuity between the old and the new settlements consists in them both counting on there being a path from understanding to instrumentality, from pure science to applied science. As Rust writes, "A fruitful note to the end goal of controlling a complex system begins by understanding it, ideally with great detail." And I've put some pictures on this slide, unrelated, they're not cited in Rust's book, but there's new work in neuroscience which is doing like really, really detailed work of like dense anatomical reconstruction, and linking this to electrophysiology, lots and lots of molecular work of figuring out what cells are going on in the brain. An important difference between the old and the new settlement lies in the scale of the challenge that comes with the attempt to understand a complex adaptive system. Because reductionist methods are insufficient and it is unwise to ignore contextual variables, it becomes necessary to collect data exhaustively at multiple levels. So these are kind of examples of low-level data collection, but the idea is that you would be collecting data at many different levels and scales as well. And the point is to cast the net as widely as possible. Rust is optimistic about the prospects for achieving this because technologies are now available for simultaneous recording in the brain at multiple levels. However, there is the threat of the data deluge, masses and masses of incomprehensible results. Again, Rust is optimistic because of technological advances in machine learning. Algorithms can mine the data for patterns. Recurrent artificial neural networks, which are models of adaptive dynamical systems, can be trained to perform cognitive tasks and reverse engineered to yield insights into the brain data. That's her proposal. In a paper cited by Rust, Rollo and co-authors offer a blueprint for a multi-scale dynamical systems approach to Alzheimer's. It's worth mentioning their 4 principles. So that in this first one, we must embrace ignorance and uncertainty. So scientists don't often talk about embracing ignorance, but what they go on to say is, in a complex nonlinear system, it can and usually does behave in a way that cannot be predicted from the behavior of its parts. So there's this challenge there. Another way of saying that is reductionism fails. You can't just look at the parts and figure out what's going on the basis of that. The second point about never knowing there's going to be a complete description, this is, they say, because the characterization of the system is always a work in progress. And I think this is due to this failure of modularity. There's always this uncertainty about what the boundaries of the system are, so you can't ever be convinced that you've got it all enclosed. This third point, we cannot design interventions by focusing on a part of the network. Again, I interpret that as this issue about problems with the assumption of modularity. Yes, the system is decomposable to some extent, but you can't just be content with working on a subcomponent of the system and not be worried that there's things going on elsewhere that are really important to the phenomenon of interest. And on this ecosystem approach, I see here this is an endorsement for interdisciplinarity and pluralism. And these, interestingly, are not ideas, new ideas when it comes to dealing with these complex multi-scale phenomena. So that's the proposal. It's time to offer some assessment of this. Firstly, it remains to be seen if it can live up to its ambitions of providing a new path to therapeutic control via understanding of these unfathomably complex processes. So what I show on this slide here is, from Rust's book again, the difference between what she calls a simplified model at the bottom and the full model, which you can say is a much more complex network, and it's still a model, so it's never the whole system. Every model is always, in its own way, simplification, but you can have greater and lesser degrees of simplification. Rust is upfront about the fact that this approach is under construction and has not yet borne therapeutic fruit. As we just saw now on that 4th principle, alongside the scientific challenge of collecting and modeling the data, there's also the sociological challenge of reorganizing research to enable the different kinds of collaboration that would be required here. Furthermore, we can ask whether a new notion of scientific understanding is viable without reductionism and the machinic picture, or if what is meant by these researchers as understanding is ultimately bound up with the old approach and its ideal of maker's knowledge. For it's not obvious what understanding now means. As Rust admits, the meaning of scientific understanding is elusive. Models of multi-level dynamical systems are not intelligible in the sense first articulated by Werner Heisenberg and more recently presented by philosopher Henk Direct. We cannot say qualitatively how altering parameters and variables will affect the behavior of this model system without actually running the simulation. As Rust puts it, these models defy intuition. It may be unavoidable that understanding requires simplification, that what scientists are aiming for when they seek understanding is a neat, intuitive picture of how a system behaves. To borrow Paul Jack's term, they seek a compression of the original messy state of affairs into a low-dimensional representation in which a very small number of factors can be shown to generate the key phenomena. The following passage from Rollo and collaborators indicates that scientists pursuing the new approach are not, in fact, giving up on the dream of discovering simplicity underneath all the complexity. So they talk about Alzheimer's, where among the almost infinite level of detail that it is possible to measure, is it possible to identify the essential detail that is needed to design interventions that control the system-level behavior? There are clues from dynamical systems theory which give us hope that the question can be answered. For example, widely different systems from earthquakes and economics to ecosystems and cell networks display the same kind of critical behavior, where abrupt changes in the state of the system can be brought about by small changes in a few or a single control variable. There is some recent evidence that this kind of behavior also occurs in the brain. Because these behaviors are observed in widely different systems, they are only weakly dependent on the details of the systems, suggesting a path to parsimony. This is an attractive insight, and the approach we advocate for in this paper is focused precisely on determining this pathway to parsimony in Alzheimer's. This passage is very revealing. For one thing, the scientists are seeking one or a small number of control variables whose effects on the system are stable and clearly traceable and can serve as handles for intervening on it. Just as under the old settlement, understanding is linked to instrumentality because both involve tracing of a causal structure, one that is useful and intelligible at the same time. Rollo et al. Argue that even for a complex dynamical system, a set of simple causal relationships might be ascertainable because, in effect, the system simplifies itself. That is, most of the details of the system turn out to be irrelevant to the global behavior of interest, such as the transition from health to disease, because there are high-level patterns that occur in a range of physically very different dynamical systems. Researchers can focus on these patterns and ignore much of the nitty-gritty detail. And this is really a very central theme of complexity science, that there are emergence of these high levels of autonomous patterns which are kind of independent of lower-level details. And so you get a license to ignore what was originally seemingly something very complex. So complexity generates simplicity would be the slogan here. However, Nicole Rust points out that more often than not, hopes for extremely general models of complex dynamical systems have not been met. The devil is often in the detail, and modelers have to dig around to find out which details and variables matter most to determining the behavior of different kinds of systems. This relates to a general remark, which is that the dynamical systems framework originated in physics, along with most of the coarse-graining, simplifying procedures used to discover high-level patterns of the sort Rollo et al. Discuss. In physics, the evidence for separation of scales, the independence of processes at different levels, is much stronger. That's why people can build bridges using Newton's laws, ignoring quantum-level effects. In biology, in neuroscience, molecular-level processes constantly interact with macro-scale ones, hence pharmacology. Particular methods for coarse graining, for abstracting away from lower-level details of a system, such as the normalization group, make assumptions about the homogeneity of the lower-level entities, which are reasonable in physics, dealing with atoms, but not in biology, since living cells are highly heterogeneous. So I'm not saying that these are completely inapplicable, but there's questions to be had about the difference that comes about when trying to apply this to biology. Another general worry is that the central concepts and techniques of complexity science are quite old, nearly as old as me, and have not produced the breakthroughs elsewhere that people might have hoped for. Well, I don't know. So the right-hand side of this slide is from a Scientific American cover from 1995, where it sort of worries about overblown hyper-round complexity science are voiced back then. And in Rust's book, she kind of she quotes this paper and kind of reiterates some of the worries that were raised then. So the optimism about these methods in neuroscience could actually be due to the novelty of their use in this field. Even though the brain is often called the most complex object known, neuroscience is actually quite late to the complexity science party, which is an interesting thing about neuroscience. Okay, so last section, nearly at the end. If the new settlement doesn't work out, we can expect that understanding and instrumentality will go their separate ways, no longer harnessed together in the marriage that has defined modern science. We can ask what would be left of the project of understanding by itself, no longer tethered to instrumental aims. Would there be a return to natural philosophy, as it once was? In this lecture, we have seen how scientists have sought simplicity in nature by conceiving it as machine-like. In many domains, this has brought astounding instrumental power: electronics, explosives, antibiotics, molecular diagnostics. However, as scientists have pushed these same simplifying methods into the domains of more and more complex systems, such as the brain, their limitations have shown. In order to achieve precision and theoretical clarity, scientists need to put boundaries around things because they cannot model everything everywhere all at once. But if, to quote the biologist Richard Levins, quoting Hegel, the true is the whole, if it is the case that in the domain of complexity everything everywhere is feverishly interactive, then we might be restricted to acknowledging the truth of this situation without being in a position to master it. And so we would be brought full circle to a kind of knowledge that can appear paradoxical, even counterfeit, after such a long habituation to the Baconian maxim that knowledge is power. We would have attained some useless knowledge. Yet there is a consolation here that I mention in the final chapter of my book. I argue that the mind-body problem, as we know it since the 17th century, is a product of the same demand for modularity for bounded domains of investigation that characterizes the modern scientific project. This was a point made often by pragmatist philosophers such as James and Dewey. In order for there to be a rigorous science of physics, qualitative mental properties had to be excluded from the domain of the physical. Finding a place for them in the natural world then became rather difficult. But if we accept that the notion of the purely physical is a simplification, an idealization, we can say that as a matter of fact, but not a fact susceptible to rigorous scientific elaboration, the mental and physical are inherently linked, or at least not radically different. The dualist intuition that prompts the mind-body problem can be dissolved. Back to where we started. Dubois-Reymond argued that explanation of the mind-body connection was beyond the limits of science. From the reanimated perspective of natural philosophy, we could instead take the apparent disconnection to be an artifact of the scientific demand for theoretical and conceptual clarity. We can therefore know that mind and body are not disconnected and relieve ourselves of the unsettling feeling that science ought to provide an explanation of their connection, though frustratingly it cannot. A piece of philosophical knowledge that is admittedly unactionable or useless. So, summing up. In this last slide, I summarize our journey towards and perhaps beyond the limits of science. Here, in the territory of the old settlement, instrumentality and understanding worked hand in hand. The systems investigated were simple enough that low-dimensional representations of their causal structures were predictively accurate and hence instrumentally effective. To borrow Poldrack's term, the compressions here executed by abstract models make sense to human scientists and tie prediction and understanding together. Beyond that, we have the territory of highly complex processes. Over here, machine learning algorithms are generating high-dimensional compressions of the data that do not make too much sense to their users. Prediction and understanding are pulling apart. Engineering is taking off on its own. Over there, scientists are sticking to the old templates of seeking instrumental control by way of understanding the system first. It remains to be seen if models that make sense to the scientists can be anything other than drastic simplifications of highly complex processes. Compressions that are too low-dimensional and too lossy to be predictively accurate and instrumentally successful. And finally, over here, a solitary natural philosopher contemplates this buzzing, seething, disorderly order of nature without seeking to tame it. The result could be therapeutic. As Wittgenstein said, the task of philosophy is to leave everything as it is. Thank you.